Okay, hello everyone. Glad you're here. We're about to hear from Dr. Stephen John Harris and Father Isaac Skidmore about healing of the person from theological and psychological perspectives. Are they compatible? Just as a reminder, if you do have questions or comments, we do ask that you speak into the microphone. I believe this one right here, right? So we'll have you come up to the front, or if it's just a short question, one of the speakers can just repeat the question into the mic for our online audiences. So Dr. Stephen John Harris has a PhD in psychology and a certificate in Jungian and psychoanalytic psychotherapy. He works in private practice and as an author of works on psychology and faith. And he attends Nativity of the Most Holy Theotokos Serbian Orthodox Church in the Western North American Diocese. Father Isaac Skidmore has a Master of Divinity from St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary, as well as a PhD in depth psychology. He works as a priest at Archangel Orthodox Church of the Orthodox Church of America in Ashland, Oregon, and he is also in private practice as a licensed professional counselor. He also writes on issues regarding the clergy, psychology, and on matters of cultural and social concerns. So welcome our speakers.
Hello, greetings. So just to kind of prime your processing of this workshop, I'd like to mention a bit of what's about to happen. Stephen John will be reading a paper that he's written, and then I will share a reaction to a specific aspect of something he's written about in his paper. And then we will facilitate discussion over some questions. And these questions are these, which appear on the screen. And so that's coming up. And as a way of focusing our attention for this talk, we thought we'd present this in the form of a kind of a thought experiment. If we imagine that we were being asked to frame useful considerations for the assembly of canonical Orthodox bishops that they can use to advise priests, confessors, and spiritual advisors concerning their role in spiritual and psychological health of their parishioners, including the issue of referrals, what would we come up with? And that's a way to kind of keep our thinking tight and focused. If at the end of this we had to present some proposals to the Assembly of Bishops, what might those be? So without further ado, Stephen John, would you like to?
Hello, and thank you for attending and participating. We hope to get a lot of input and some questions from you as we conduct this, both the information and also maybe moving forward with some questions. OCAMPR has accepted that it's an asset to the Orthodox faith to have professionals who assist parishioners with psychological and medical expertise. Many writings and case material have gone a long way to support this new gospel. But on what footing do we stand, and how clearly do we understand the role of the Orthodox psychotherapist? What kind of relationship do we have with the Church and its clergy? Historically, there has been the view within the Church that the Church and her sacraments are the only necessary healing or therapy that is needed for healing human beings. This was represented rather powerfully in the writings of Lacos, who introduced counseling and psychotherapy into the Church. And we are on legitimate footing in this. I'm sorry, I skipped something. By introducing counseling and psychotherapy into the Church, are we on legitimate footing? And if so, how should we proceed? As to the question of footing, many of us would answer in the affirmative. The Assembly of Orthodox Canonical Bishops of the United States of America has partnered with OCAMPR to establish a mental health task force. Perhaps this is a step towards a conciliar relationship between the two. However, This explicit embrace of psychotherapy is relatively new territory, which is in a dialectic tension with our faith, the same tension experienced by many other sciences who have brought their perspectives into dialogue with the Church. To raise some ways this question has already been referenced, I cite Michael Baker, who divides horizontal and vertical axes, the latter which is associated with depth psychologies, which study the unconscious, and who invites us to ask what implications this has for the mind of a Christian. The psychoanalytic depth psychology explores the influence of the unconscious on the person. Despite the unconscious having been implicated in many of our passions and sins, Metropolitan Callisto Square declares that the dreams and the unconscious fall within the scope of the divine image. Deacon Stephen Hughes states, psychoanalysis can be an important and powerful ally in the search for religious maturity by helping persons examine the unconscious wellsprings of the faith and images of God. Also to be considered is the role of the horizontal axis, CBT, behavior therapy, and psychoeducational measures implied by the Father's writings, and more recently by such persons as Elder Thaddeus, who writes convincingly on how our thoughts determine our lives. I'd like to highlight briefly that these axes are not completely mutually exclusive. Many CBT therapists find themselves deep in the unconsciousness of their clients and patients, and sometimes depth psychologists can be drawn into some of the very important thought processes that seems to sound like psychotherapy at times. Given the fact that so many forms of psychotherapy inhibit faith or enhances it, if not shuts out expressions of faith, can we ignore psychopathology's destructive influences on one's faith? Sure. And if we do not ignore these obstructive effects, how shall we, within the context of both psychotherapy and the clergy, approach that? While medications can be a helpful contribution in terms of symptom management, are we willing to accept their frequent mind-numbing effects to be the only cure? Does science support the notion that medications cure mental disorders? Why do some Orthodox Christians accept the medical solution but not the solution of a medical psychotherapy? If psychotherapy is given a role in the Church, can it realistically, despite its secular origins and at times seeming disparity and illegitimacy to church goals, not contradict the mission of the Church, and more importantly, can it be compatible with the Church and its goals? There are many ways that these disciplines do contradict each other, but there are important ways that we can verify that are compatible to the benefit of our faith. Any examination of compatibility must consider these two disciplines' respective roles. So with role considerations in mind, should the priest or spiritual father play a principal role in the treatment of suicidal persons, psychoses, paranoid persons, etc.? And if so, how? Does a psychotherapist rightly guide his or her patient in matters of faith? How responsible should a psychotherapist be for knowing spiritual matters relevant to their psychological condition? How far can psychology take the Christian? Should these roles be distinct, or are there times when the two should collaborate? Is there a thing such as a Christian psychotherapist, and if there is, how far should they go in their function in their profession? Can either discipline overstep their function? Issues of boundaries. What about the role of the priest who is also a therapist, which we have many these days, some even here in this room? Can she wear both hats at the same time, or should she change their roles explicitly? Should this be a turf war or collaboration? We hope you'll answer the latter. Despite offering a differing viewpoint, each of these disciplines studies the same subject, the human person. Human spiritual and emotional problems are complex. St. Maximus writes of the distinction between the corruptions of nature, where human developmental psychopathology is implied, and corruption of the will, or moral character. Both clergy and psychotherapists influence issues of corruption of nature that includes emotional difficulties and defiance or failures of the will. How are we able to address both kinds of corruption? The thrust of the incarnational and eschatological vision of the Church speaks to the person's relation to God, restoring life from non-being into being. Modern and postmodern subjects now present their spiritual and emotional sicknesses in need of a cure. How must the practice of Orthodox theology by the clergy and spiritual fathers approach the psychological and spiritual ills of its adepts? Can psychology be entrusted as a partner in this endeavor, and if so, can it operate cooperatively and compatibly within the Church? What kinds of provisions can aid in both emotional and spiritual healing? Do certain theological dissociation or defenses often foreclose upon or obscure choice of moral will, for instance? Does psychology sometimes underrepresent the role of the will where spiritual matters are concerned? And is each discipline able to recognize distinctions between will and nature in this matter? Does psychotherapy and Orthodox theology teach conceptualized elements of the anthropology and ontology of the human being that, when taken together, more nearly appreciate the full complexity that is involved? Since each addresses respective parts of the person from different angles, might they benefit from collaborating? Theology's position is that there is not being without restoration to the uncreated order. Sin or separation, as defined by the Fathers, results from separation and results in not being alive, which is in fact death. And this death is one death in which one is not able to die but remain in torment. But if we take a strong hint from St. Maximus, this corruption is not always exclusively due to willfulness or disobedience. Both corruption of nature and of will become an important dialect about our complex but humbling task. Defining or describing the role of the clergy or spiritual father and that of the psychotherapist is the question we are wrestling in this talk, and in the implication also of the priority of the ascending bishops. These roles bring up many issues for us to appreciate as we address the challenges brought by the differences between these two fields and are important in this dialogue potential collaboration. There are, from both the field of psychotherapy and that of clergy, great fears about the effects of role confusion, some supported by real stories. One example is when secular professionals contributed to a vulnerable Christian falling away from their faith. We also share stories of well-meaning clergy or spiritual fathers providing spiritual advice that unfortunately plunges the person advised deeper into depression. Even more powerfully, how does one split the atom in the case of what clearly appears to be both a demon-possessed individual who also has horrific life experiences of child abuse and dissociative phenomena like dissociative identity disorder? It is easy to appreciate that evil forces exploit a person's trauma to turn that person against God. At the same time, many psychological defenses against the trust and faith involved in connecting to others may be mistaken for willful disobedience, resistance, and or rejection of God. Is it necessary in cases like these to have a turf war, or can spiritual fathers, priests, and a religiously minded and respectful psychotherapist work together? This example may speak to the potential benefits of compatibility, one that requires both spiritual discernment and expert collaboration. With these brief considerations in mind, we will ask throughout this short presentation, not only are Orthodox theology and psychotherapy compatible, but also can they, in actuality, work together? By this it is meant, how can clergy and spiritual fathers work collaboratively with mental health professionals and vice versa? How might we begin to discuss a model or models for this collaboration? And finally, we will argue that to not perceive that this effort is potentially quite damaging to the parishioner. I'd like to talk about ideological conflicts. Freud, in his professional capacity, made statements about religion being an infantile or childlike regression. C.G. Timpus calls this an epistemological fallacy because Freud makes a claim about religion using psychological conditions under another ontological category. These statements could have been also be seen to fuel ideological conflict by exceeding the boundaries of this discipline into the metaphysical and theological world. Correspondingly, when psychology tries to provide religious and theological answers from its own discipline standpoint, it degrades its own discipline and pretends to have knowledge of something of which it is ignorant, a theologically informed anthropology. So this would be another ontological fallacy to cross over from one's expertise. At the same time, and equally problematic, what about the case of a clerical or spiritual father telling the suicidal person to pray more when that person begins to express the boundless pain for which they're seeking understanding and comfort? Each discipline must play a role in these matters, but it seems critical for each to know that they are extending past their domain and may require the other's expertise. As well-intended and important as prayer is, our hope and faith grown by shutting down an emotional plea like this with a simple exhortation to pray, without opening up those avenues of pain with which another healing presence in the form of compassion can hope grow for this, from finding the source of suffering on the way to answering the very prayer for healing that was made, be recognized and received. And more importantly, are these failures to provide adequate safety for the individual who's in this state of mind. Another important area of this dialectical tension lies within the individual helper who is in the dual role of both pastor and mental health professional and wears both hats. Similarly, for the Christian psychotherapist, or for that matter, pastoral counselor or priest, who is weighing spiritual and psychological matters in their own mind, when and how does the conflict go on within the helper? This can also be an area of some confusion and controversy, since matters of spiritual and emotional health are concerns of both, and often there is considerable overlap. Which role is employed? Therapist, concerned listening, confessor, spiritual guide, or when is it wise to bring in the other discipline to address these matters? We must be reminded that there are many needs, emotional and spiritual, yet there is but one person in front of us. We seem to have barely established legitimacy for these two callings to work together. In these important cases, we see that this is a very muddy issue. So now to the Orthodox Church and its relationship to science. The Orthodox Church, dating back to the early Church Fathers, have been in dialogue with the science of the day. The Orthodox orientation to this dialogue, unlike the Western approach with its Hegelian dialectic, which involves the synthesis of the synthesis the synthesis of the thesis and the antithesis, can lead to the thesis of church dogma being subject to a watering down, thus drifting away from the original truth. Orthodoxy has long related to new knowledge via tension with antithesis between its beliefs and new knowledge. The Church has functioned through and progressed by maintaining the sameness of its dogma, but it has benefited from more information from science without changing its dogma. Potentially, there is spiritual progress and resiliency, perhaps even deepening the wonder and mystery inherent within the dogma. When it comes to dealing with psychology, the Church is still navigating this tension. The potential downfall of this effort can be the result of ideological rigidity rather than failed dogma. Here, one may be mindful of Christ with the Samaritan woman at the well. There are so many dimensions of this conversation, but one of them that stands out in this discussion is Christ's attentiveness, sensitivity, discernment, compassion, etc., to clarify the truth rather than a stance of dogma or ideological rigidity. To help the Church and the discipline of psychology to be suited for the dialogue with modernity and postmodernism, we will list some important foundational issues for our consideration in this dialogue. By definition, depth psychology is a method of investigation which has already been stated, essentially works towards bringing into conscious the unconscious meaning of the words, actions, and products of the imagination, dreams, fantasies, and delusions of a particular subject. The term analysis comes from the Greek word meaning to loosen. Just as scientists have loosened the structure of matter, further breaking it down into its atoms and molecules, Freud set out to break down the patterns of human behavior into their component energies and mechanisms, laying bare what was on the surface in order to venture into the caverns of the mind. But Orthodox theology, by definition, is viewed as theology as both cataphatic and apophatic of the Trinitarian God, including the incarnation of the divine Logos, brought about by the reception of the teachings of the apostles of Christ, which teachings are believed to be based on eyewitness, revelation, and indwelling of the Holy Spirit to the body of believers and to the patristic fathers. These teachings stress Catholicity and eschatological vision, and with its salvific goal of theosis, human restoration to God is positive as all that the human desires. We see that psychoanalysis does not make the same kind of ontological claims that the Church does, and does not exclusively view growth or health involving God or restoration to Him. At the same time, many modern psychoanalytic writers are in positive dialogue with spirituality, religion, and the Church. With or without this positive dialogue, must we ask if the therapeutic work of improving consciousness contributes to faith by exposing the barriers to that faith and also showing that change is possible? There are different goals within the two disciplines. Psychoanalysis and depth psychology seeks to trace the influence of the unconscious on the mind, and it is aimed at uncovering conflicts and other contents of the unconscious to alleviate suffering. Cognitive treatments seek to correct distorted thinking and expectations. Orthodox theology's goal is to achieve theosis, or conformity to and intimate union with God. This is sometimes expressed thus: God became man, so that man might become God. Some of the greatest saints have achieved in this life a measure of this process. Man's greatest potential is realized in communion with that which made him. The goals as stated are different. Namely, psychology does not explicitly set out to address faith or theosis. Again, however, there are times when the awareness of and the alleviation of barriers in the mind, such as distorted thinking, conflicts, dissociation due to trauma, and defenses that block human and divine connection, can they support the aims of faith in this work? A greater conflict emerges when one fallaciously addresses the wrong ontological category. However, they potentially enhance each other when each contributes their own knowledge and shares it. Ontologically, as philosophically assigned, ontology explains the nature of being and existence, and it is the branch of metaphysics which describes the nature of being. Orthodox theology makes the philosophical definition a complete and true one for theology, and it illuminates ontology. Ontology in Christianity is to describe being and existence always as owing to and in relation to the persons of the Trinity, the hypostasis. For psychoanalysis and depth psychologies, one representative, Thomas Ogden, states that the goal of ontological psychoanalysis has to do with becoming, being, and becoming, and is one of allowing the patient to experience creatively the discovery and meaning for himself, and in that state of being become more fully alive. Thus, psychoanalysis does not offer a thorough or complete ontology in a philosophical or theological sense, but only goes so far. Again, the emphasis in psychoanalysis is much more on the actual experience of being alive, emotions, and so forth. Does this mean that psychoanalysis cannot contribute to the aims of faith? It seems that becoming more open to experience and emotional aliveness would contribute to a more flexible and engaging relationship with God. For anthropology is the study, of course, of the human person, especially understood in theological terms as the way for humanity in its present condition to relate to the divine plan of salvation. Christian anthropology was thus mainly occupied with the twin ideas of how the human being is constituted and how the human being had fallen from grace and could return to God's glory. Thus, the anthropology of the Christian is a theanthropology, and man's archetype is therefore not simply the logos, but the incarnate logos. The core of the human being, therefore, is the hypostasis. The field of anthropology and the sciences is broadly the study of man, for example, his physical and cultural appearance and evolution as a species. Psychoanalysis and psychotherapies bring to the field of anthropology a kind of mapping of the human mind. This anthropology does not mention God except as relevant to the content and function of the human mind. Because of Freud's early stance by pathologizing religion, psychoanalysis had to struggle with the dismissive and dogmatic view it had towards religion. Psychoanalysis has warmed to spirituality, religion, and faith in recent years, while retaining an emphasis on the mapping of the mind versus weighing in on metaphysical and theological matters. There are common values. Like Orthodoxy, psychology and psychoanalysis also value healthy relationships. Freud viewed health as loving, well, and having healthy relationships. Both perspectives value the hidden truths found in the heart. Both the teachings of the patristic fathers and psychoanalysis, and I don't think cognitive therapy disputes this, seem to indicate that self-awareness is necessary for an authentic relationship with God, with Orthodoxy valuing repentance and movement towards God. It goes quite a bit further, as we know. Thus, consciousness is oriented towards awareness of God, not a self apart from God. Both endeavors are committed to confession of truth, which can be humbling, with Orthodoxy taking an extra step to the sacraments, including confession and communion. There are some different values, however. According to Deacon News, psychoanalysis seeks insight, autonomy, and adaptation to social norms, while for Orthodoxy the goal is to enhance vulnerability to God's grace. Psychoanalysis is oriented towards human norms, while the Orthodox norms are centered on the goal of theosis. Increasing human vitality is the goal of psychoanalysis, while the indwelling of the divine is the goal of Orthodoxy. Psychoanalysis without religion can lead to an awareness of the self apart from God, while Orthodox faith is aimed at awareness of the self in God. Somewhere in between those two poles, though, is in most modern psychotherapies the involved relationship of being more open and vulnerable to the other, God, fellow human beings, and so forth. So there's a lot of in between those two poles. I'd like to return to the intersection between the two disciplines. Even with the differences in values that we've discussed, psychoanalysis and Orthodoxy do have growing areas of intersection. Both promote healthy relationships and hold on to similar attitudes towards suffering and its potential benefit to the faithful. Anna Marie Rizzuto states, "I believe that it is possible to say that a good portion of our suffering and difficulties results from the inability to acknowledge our psychic participation in the creation of these painful interpretations and psychical acts, conscious and unconscious. And the capacity to stand pain allows for the acceptance into conscious awareness of the repudiated repudiated psychical acts, and with it, the alleviation of suffering. Despite Freud's position that educating to reality includes ridding ourselves of the illusion of religion, psychoanalysis has actually become closer to religion in faith in recent years. Man is repeatedly found to be homo-religious. His innate spiritual instinct is one that seems present from human consciousness of God, sin, and evil. Can psychological disciplines be utilized with a helpful perspective to aid the church and priesthood? The issue at stake seems to be not whether psychotherapeutic disciplines should address theological, namely corruption of will, but whether psychology should be involved in healing of the corruption of natural energies in the psyche. And if so, can the theologically driven spiritual functions of the church work together with psychotherapists? And conversely, can psychotherapists appreciate, respect, and not overstep those same spiritual functions? What should the nature of the relationship be? There's obviously no one-size-fits-all, and yet we are what are some of the basic ingredients of this collaboration? We run the risk, I had a tough time finding an image for this, but of pulling a person apart by having competing disciplines for communication, not collaborating. And then if we engage in this discussion further, what are the things that shore up the person if the two disciplines work together more collaboratively in their communication? So there are many reasons to view the conflicts, dialogue, and discipline in psychology and theology to be able to move towards more fruitful results for congregants. We have prepared some case material, some other questions to follow, but first, Father Isaac will be responding to a portion of this as we begin to try to discuss the muddy waters of this relationship, and hopefully theology and psychology need not be in conflict, but the examination of how each of the disciplines implement and work together can be a more fruitful discussion.
Okay, this reaction here takes place under the umbrella of question 1. As here on the board, are psychotherapy and theology compatible? In just a moment, Stephen, John, and I will invite you to share some thoughts of yours about the relationship between the Church's theology of healing and the healing that occurs through psychotherapy. As a way to stimulate this conversation, I'd like to offer a first reaction to Stephen John's paper. Stephen John's paper describes the complex issues in dialogue between the Church and psychology. One temptation that has sometimes appeared is the attitude that the Church should be regarded as self-sufficient when it comes to addressing mental health concerns. This perspective casts doubt on the possibility of a positive relationship between theology and psychology. One notable example of a theological perspective that runs, in my opinion, the risk of overemphasizing the Church's exclusive possession of the capacity to promote healing is that of Archimandrite Theologios Vlachos in his book, The Illness and Cure of the Soul in Orthodox Tradition. While it is not my intention to disparage this work, I suspect it does not adequately account for the vision of OCAMPR, in which the science of mental health therapy is valued, I dare say, as more than just a concession to the unchurched world. This particular work of Vlachos includes several assertions that do not satisfy me. Number one, he says that psychology in the West was discovered only because the churches of the West have lost the hesychastic tradition of the Church. Number two, he says that in psychology, the soul is not in the image of God, as in Orthodox theology, but it is a simple activity of the body. Thirdly, he says anthropocentric psychology cannot distinguish between created and uncreated energies. In other words, whether an illness is due to exhaustion or to possession. Neither does it accept the activities of uncreated grace, he says. It attributes everything only to one factor. Psychology does not believe in the existence of the devil, and for the most part denies the actions of the uncreated grace of God. He does make room for psychology, but only by concession. We accept by economy, he says, the views of contemporary psychology and psychotherapy in two cases. He then goes on to mention, quote, people whose nervous system has been harmed because of various reasons, psychical or mental overstress, and now face serious psychological problems, and people who by choice do not have any relation with the church and its mysteries. For these, he says, I think they can be helped by modern psychology, psychotherapy, so as not to be driven to an irreparable condition. Psychology can act as a painkiller to comfort them in the dreadful prison of despair in which they are. Finally, he allows psychology as a concession to, as he describes, people who confess and are related to spiritual fathers, but the latter do not have the strength and knowledge of spiritual life to help them. For, he says, we should not turn a blind eye to existing reality. As I say, I imagine the consensus of all of us in this room is generally more optimistic about the role psychology can play in healing, not merely as a fill-in for one's inability to access the resources of the church. I think Blacklist's perspective is unfairly limited for a variety of reasons. Primarily, perhaps, because it fails to recognize the extent to which many forms of psychology, even humanistic and so-called secular psychology, implicitly and explicitly recognize transcendent and transpersonal dimensions of human existence. One can think of Jung's description of the self, Bion's description of O. One can recall Viktor Frankl's assertion to the effect that man is most himself when he is related to what is beyond himself. One can also think of Abraham Maslow's understanding of self-actualization, an idea to which Carl Rogers also pays homage, which implies that human growth is motivated by intrinsic inclination towards wholeness, which a therapist supports through respectful awe, holding space for a process of growth and healing that defies complete understanding. OCAMPR would not exist if there were not the belief among us that there is some relation between the healing that takes place in medicine and psychological work and the healing of human nature by God and Jesus Christ. And this relation does not have to be understood as just one of derivation, as though these contemporary healing sciences had usurped what should be seen as exclusively belonging to the church. As Philip Mamalakis said in dinner conversation last night, Orthodoxy is the revelation of the pattern that underlies all of reality. As therapists who are Orthodox, we have an advantage not in possessing more of the truth, but in being gifted with the vision of the archetype of healing. So we can be attuned to it and throw ourselves into cooperation with its movements when we see it appear in our patients and clients. The fact that so-called secular psychology should intuit and attest to the empirical reality of these same healing movements should not surprise us. To the extent they ask what is truth, we should not be surprised when what they see is the same truth attested to by the great seers of our own tradition. This, in my opinion, is a correspondence to be celebrated rather than barely and only begrudgingly acknowledged. If it is the same or ignored, we increase the likelihood that church theology and practice will collide, as often as it might collude, with the perspective available in psychology and mental health. If we consciously tend to it, we have a better chance these two perspectives might work together for the benefit of those who are our parishioners and or clients. All of this highlights the importance of the dialogue to which Stephen John's paper now invites us. So for practical purposes, this reaction to Stephen John's paper represents an affirmation, an affirmative answer to the question. To question number one. Are they compatible? Even if you do not agree with me in all the particulars, I hope you have reasons of your own for believing there is at least enough compatibility between theology and psychology to now entertain our second question in discussion. So here's where we turn to all of you and asking the question, what are the boundaries? What are the boundaries between these two domains? And maybe to stir your thought, at what point might an Orthodox clergy person or spiritual advisor be wise to consider the possibility that they are unhelpfully transgressing into matters that are more proper to psychotherapy? And vice versa, when might a psychotherapist consider the possibility they are transgressing into matters better handled from the church? Could be possible. I mean, the boundaries between the two.
I'm a family physician, so I see patients and I think about them and try to help them from a holistic standpoint. And I will also say, I think that in my years of practice, in fact, learning and embracing humility has enabled me to understand what I can manage, what I can recognize would be more effectively managed by someone else with a different knowledge base than I. My job is just kind of see what the additional needs would be and then step back and try to guide therapy in the best manner for the patient.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's very important. I'm not sure how related my response to that is, but I was thinking of how this morning's task force discussion, we were talking about emotional needs versus spiritual needs, and how important it can be to maybe not get caught into the is this spiritual or emotional, but is there both, because they can affect each other. And we're going to look at that more almost intensively in question number 3. But it seems like it would be helpful to have a dialogue between priests and therapists about, what we do and how we can help with the emotional without upstaging the spiritual part of the process. So, anyway, do you have any more comments about that?
Your answer anticipated something that we had thought about actually for question 3, that is that underlying humility, I think, is really, really essential in all of this. To always understand that if our goal is to help the person, and that goes for both from the church side and the psychotherapy side, humility is a part of that. It's always understanding that we seem to know some things about what's happening with the person, but to claim that everything almost always sets us up for doing a disservice at some level. So.
I was thinking about in relation to this question, whether which one I just appreciate how often it is, because it's something that I really thought in my own. It's like a particularly stupid issue like spiritual abuse, the issue of spiritual abuse, and just how, for many people, there are really painful messages that you receive about God. Coming from my McCartney story, and coming with stealing from some of the Reformed theology that kind of reinforced my own, that inner critic or whatever voice, whatever kind of way you want to address it. And so if God is my inner critic, that sets up a really unhelpful relationship, or a really unhelpful view of who God is. And so I'm really grateful to a really perceptive spiritual father who's helped me to undo a lot of that. And I wonder, well, what if I have been inadvertently, one way or another, reinforced some of those messages that I had from that kind of underlined that inherent goodness and worthiness that we go to the situation. So that's one thing.
So I don't know if you have other issues. We need to move probably to question number 3. And this kind of does go together. But I wanted to say more about this tricky area of boundaries and so forth. It seems like if we can work out, just setting aside for the issues of confidentiality and, assuming you have free exchange between the priest and spiritual father and therapist, because that can range from like, oh, I can trust you, you can talk about everything you want, on down to like, terrified, don't talk about anything right now or something. But assuming you have the luxury to communicate, it's so helpful for a therapist to know some of the, at least the general spiritual issues, that they don't work against that. And also, if this issue I raised in the paper, there can be a difference between dissociation or some other kind of problem going on, instead of just resisting or not complying to the suggestion of the spiritual father or something. And so knowing what each other's up to can be really valuable if that's possible.
So I actually write letters every week to my priest, therapist, and cultural sponsor, and they get the same letter. So I tell them everything, and then individually I talk to them about what they're specialized in, because they're not going to have the same reaction. But I'm really blessed to have a father who's my here, and he's like really into 12-step, and their family believes in therapy. So they use terms like association to describe flashbacks, that sort of thing. And my 12-step sponsor believes in spiritual healing through this 12-step. And my therapist is Orthodox. So all of them respond, and they know they're for this because they're mature experts. And they sometimes will say, oh, tell your therapist I said this, or tell your priest I said this. I would practice with your priest's wife, right? And they don't know each other personally, but they know each other in correspondence. And we have a very transparent relationship. But it's taken me 9 therapists to get here, and however many churches and jurisdictions, and however many 12-step groups. Now I have this beautiful situation. But I've had to work at it as a patient and a client. So I just wanted to bring it up as possible. I created it.
I'm very appreciative of your growth and your ability to communicate and be that vulnerable and just participate in the process that way.
Thank you. And we can put question 3 on the board because it all kind of rolls together in the conversations about question 3 much as you know. I'm going to say something that might be a little bit controversial. Because I'm a priest and I work as a therapist. And there are times when, and this relates to the question of spiritual abuse, I can't always guarantee when somebody seeks me for therapy, I can't always guarantee that the therapeutic work is going to make them a better Orthodox Christian. I can't always guarantee that it's going to make them at peace with everything going on in the parish, with dynamics, even ones that are considered normal and healthy within a particular parish. And I think that that's part of the integrity of the therapeutic practice is that there is sometimes a situation where self-discovery and movement towards authenticity really does entail, perhaps at least for a time, somebody stepping away from certain environments. And that can be, I understand that's threatening to clergy in some of the Orthodox world, but I think that it's important that evaluation of truth in the context of therapy, I think entails that in a sense. And so it's a risky venture. And at the same time, it can go the other way, where somebody can
in connecting more deeply with themselves, they come to understand how it is that their faith is inside of them, and they can engage it far more authentically than ever did. But I don't think there can be a guarantee, because I'm taking this person's plan, I'm going to make sure that they're set down in that environment every day. It may not be the case. Thank you, Father Isaac. I think there's an interesting kind of, irony or paradox. There's an expectation that it'll improve their faith. What won't they talk about? Sometimes trying to protect or too rigidly hold on to once they have to want to let go, but what won't be addressed and talked about if we're a bit too rigidly dug into that idea. So the truth is still valuable. So we have not a whole lot longer, but I wanted to revisit the case idea I gave earlier in the paper of the individual who's both observed the behaviors of demon possession and lots of trauma and dissociative identity disorder related symptoms. I don't want us to race to, a lot of solutions as much as like what would be some of the important communication issues and issues from both sides of this, the priest, spiritual father, or the therapist to think about, be aware of, communicate about. What are some of the, I don't mean the specifics of the disorder or, demon possession, but just what are some things that would be helpful, because I think it illustrates how probably there's this center point in which evil forces take advantage of the poor human person's trauma and turn them against God, and then there's this other trauma itself. So, yes.
Well, that's what came to my mind immediately was the idea of fragmentation and how documentary we to discover it's called water and talks about fragmentation speak and benefit of our spiritual condition, like our fragmentation with ourselves and our fragmentation with God and our fragmentation with people around us. And so on the spiritual side, understanding the neuroscience and trauma and like what happens, like what happens in our brain becomes parts that really in the case of the PID, like we see also the full extent of that. That's what I see in fragmentation.
So maybe for them to both be aware of and discuss that perspective alone is very helpful. So, yeah, it's a very beautiful perspective. Yes.
Looking on a real practical level, one thing that I feel like my parish priest has done really well is speak about mental health in sermons. And one point even brought up his wife, our sister Sarah, and she did her own talk on dealing with depression herself. And when I got to him with my feelings of depression, he's always encouraged me to talk to multiple people and, not be afraid of anything if that's needed, not be afraid of seeking other therapies. So normalizing that, especially in the context of the church inside of our Western Christianity realm.
Terrific, thank you. That's a very nice situation. I'd like to see that all over. Other issues? Okay. Yes, yeah.
So this is kind of a flip side. This past year, the home parish that I grew up in experienced suicide, and I was present during the practice and the conversation afterwards when the parish was coming together for the first time and trying to think of what happened. It was extremely tragic for the young boy who actually shot one of his parents before committing suicide. So it was extremely tragic, and the whole community tradition as well in the church's ability to acknowledge mental health as a severe issue that we're dealing with no matter what. So, collaboration and no collaboration, we're seeing increasing instances of mental disasters. But there was a part of the conversation afterwards that touched on this question that you posed about, how do we kind of reconcile, mental health and this question of is this possession, and is this, is this a chemical imbalance, what is this? How do we define this as a church community? And there's this excellent scene in Reverend Canonical, I was so yesterday, where I think he just places it so beautifully. The middle brother Ivan is experiencing like a hallucination where the third is kind of like physically ambiguous about whether or not it's possession or if it's becoming. And it's very clear the way that he is working to put that to Ivan's real problem is disconnection. It's disconnection from the community. And so as a church and, as a healthcare community, how are we facilitating connection? I didn't think so.
I was going to throw in one more thing. Steve and John and I were preparing for this and kind of wrestling with the question of, on a practical level, how do we think about boundaries? How do we kind of navigate those two territories? And one metaphor that I think is useful is simply the analogy of the hat. Which hat are you wearing? If you're wearing the hat of the church, you say the hat of a priest at a moment, then you speak from that perspective. And when you're wearing that hat, you can borrow from the other field. You can borrow from, so if you're wearing the hat of a spiritual advisor or priest, you can borrow from psychological knowledge. But I think it's helpful if you make that explicit. If you make it clear that, okay, we're going to use a piece of psychological understanding here because it contributes to what we're doing right now. It contributes to what we're doing as part of the church. But you maintain clarity about which role you're in at a given moment. And then you can do the other as well. Because the goal in this, I don't think, should ever be just to make the boundaries just much. I think that doesn't help. There does need to be a way of distinguishing from which place are we speaking. But then to be able to utilize the wisdom from the other side was the case. But I think we can explicitly.
You're probably getting here. Okay. Yeah.
This is sort of a response as well as an anecdote. And this was recent. I presented an idea to my priest about having a mental health support group in the church that I would sort of take the lead on and try to facilitate that. And he responded very diplomatically, but in no uncertain terms, stated that it was a liability in a sense, that we could not effectively do that. So I guess my question or my thinking is along the lines of having some sort of integrated model in our parish communities and our churches where, I know probably not every church can have a therapist or someone facilitating a group, but I think it's worth thinking about to tend to the needs of our community because I see a great need. And I think our parishes are places of safety for a lot of people. Myself included, who have mental health issues or are dealing with mental health issues. And other people may not be able to venture outside of their parish or outside of their spiritual home.
with setting those boundaries, I think that would be really helpful for the parishioners.
Thank you, and I'll just wrap it up with this. I agree. I think that people have different levels of readiness to address issues, and so just to make things a safe environment and to talk about these things, not always driving the therapy, and this is a great idea. I think that's part of what hoping comes out of this conversation. Is what are some ideas that we can begin to formulate to include an idea like that in the parish? Have that more accessible, and not just with referrals to therapists. And one other boundary issue that comes to mind for me that I want to add is that I sort of have a lot of empathy for priests who I think, I shouldn't speak for them, but my perception when I talk with them is that they seem to have a lot of pressure to address all the issues under this spiritual, and that I would hope that they could learn that spiritual issues, it's not a lack of faith or a problem if you have an emotional issue or something you want to talk through or a loss or whatever it is. And that I think there's some hesitancy to refer, like, well, I don't know if it's serious enough. And it'd be nice to have them learn about, like, what therapists do. Like, we might tell them, like, your issues really aren't that bad. You probably just needed one session to talk about this thing that just happened or whatever comes out of it. But it almost feels like the priests would have less pressure on themselves if they could make that distinction and feel supported and that we weren't working against them. So, and I think we're about there. So, thank you, Father Isaac. And, thank you.